into that around there.
Okay, everyone, I think I'd like to get started. I'll have a little extra time because I know people have class sometimes until 3:15 on Wednesdays, so we'll probably have a few people coming in here and there. But my name is Lindsay Otsukura. I'm the new director for the Center for East Asian Studies. I'm following on the heels of Michelle Mason, who's in the back there. So my senpai is here as well, and she's now the director, the chair of the Department of East Asian Studies. So today, we're very happy to welcome Adam Brookes, who's actually been our artist in residence last year as well as this year. He graciously agreed to extend for another year. Last year, some of you may have seen him present about his fictional trilogy, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm very honored and pleased to welcome Adam, who will discuss his ongoing research on the fate of China's imperial art collection during World War II. Before giving him the floor, I'd like to provide a few details about his background for those of you who might not be familiar with his career and his publications. Adam was born in Canada, but grew up in Oxfordshire in the UK. And after studying Chinese at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, he went on to become a journalist, working for the BBC as a copy taster. He can explain that to you, not me. Then a radio producer for the BBC World Service, and subsequently was a foreign correspondent in Indonesia, China, and eventually the United States, where he now resides. He's conducted reporting from over 30 countries, including Iraq, Afghanistan, North Korea, and Mongolia for the BBC television and radio. As I said, some of you may be familiar with Adam's fictional trilogy, which began with The Night Heron, a novel published in 2014 that draws on his time in China. This was named a top-notch thriller by the Washington Post and the best book of the year by NPR. The second novel in his series, Spy Games, was published in 2015, and he followed that with The Spy's Daughter, published in 2017. As I mentioned, Adam was kind enough to speak about these fictional works at his first CEAS presentation, which he gave last February. Today, however, Adam will be giving a work-in-progress talk about his new nonfiction project. The title of his talk is The Art of the Forbidden City During World War II, How China's Vast Imperial Art Collection Was Hidden and Kept Safe from the Japanese Invasion. It traces the fascinating and rarely discussed steps that were taken to secure the safety and preservation of a vast array of Chinese imperial artworks beginning in the 1930s. Rather than reveal any further details, I'll now pass the baton on to Adam. Please join me in welcoming him here today.
Thank you very much. Lindsay, thank you very much indeed for having me back for another year to the Center for East Asian Studies, which is just a fantastic approach for me. Thank you, Michelle, for having me last year. Thank you, Margaret Pearson, for introducing me to it in the first place. I'm very, very grateful. Great to be here. Thank you for coming on a Wednesday afternoon. It's really nice to see a nice core of people. A caveat to start this whole thing. I'm a journalist and a fiction writer. I'm not a historian, and I'm not an academic. So my approach may look a little offbeat, and if it looks a little disorganized, that's because it is. And this is my first attempt to get into narrative historical nonfiction, and you're the first people to have it presented to in public. So it's all a little tentative today. There are still big gaps in the story. I'm still doing research. I sense these gaps as we go along. I'll talk for a bit and show you some images, and then we'll do some questions, of which there will be many. I have many questions, I'm sure you do. The Forbidden City. There it is, in the center of Beijing. Built in the 15th century by the Ming emperors, by Yongle. This is the larger imperial city, referred to as the imperial city, originally through the Ming and Qing dynasties from the 15th century through to 1911. This was the sort of outer areas where there are areas of government. This was the inner imperial city. The lower part of it here was called the outer court, the WWII. And this is where the emperor interacted with his ministers and with government. The upper part of it here is the real Forbidden City. This was the Neike, the inner court, where the emperor, his household, his consorts, his concubines, and the imperial household resided. And nobody ever went in. Only the imperial household, that's why it's called the Forbidden City. Only the imperial household saw it. inside this broad area, there was an absolutely colossal collection of art. We call it a collection. That's the word I'm going to use. It wasn't a collection really in the Western sense of it. So it's kind of a contested term. But I'm going to call it a collection because I can't think of anything better. There are about roughly 1 million or so pieces of what we now call art scattered around these compounds. Paintings, porcelain, ancient bronzes, entire libraries done in calligraphy. Calligraphy is art, cloisonne, ivory, lacquer, tapestry, musical instruments, furniture, you name it. There was a vast collection of stuff. It was distributed between different palaces and halls, and a lot of it was just in storerooms because there was so much of it. It served multiple purposes. It was decorative. Some of it was for ritual purposes. It was involved in the enormously elaborate Confucian rituals conducted by the emperor. A lot of it was literary. There were whole libraries of history, philosophy, literature, science. A lot of it was historical, and much of it was for the personal delight and enrichment and study of the emperor. And the collection as a whole had a kind of purpose of enriching and legitimizing the imperial presence. It was deeply tied up with the emperor and the idea of imperial China. Now, the collection, as we're going to think about it, goes back a long way. I mean, it goes back to the Song dynasty and beyond. Some of the things in it go back millennia to 2000 BC. But the collection, as we think about it, was really shaped by this guy. Anybody able to name him? Anyone know who that is? That is the Qianlong Emperor. Reigned 1735 to 1796. Perhaps the greatest of the Qing dynasty emperors. Anybody know who painted that? It was painted actually by a Jesuit, an Italian Jesuit, called Giuseppe Castiglione, who arrived in Qing China and was admitted to the court and became an artist for the court and tried to introduce Western portraiture into China until he was firmly told to stop because they didn't like single point perspective and they didn't like shading and they didn't like single point fall of light, and he was told to learn Chinese portraiture, which he did, but with a sort of Western touch. Anyway, that's the Qianlong Emperor. How did the collection get there? Some of it was commissioned by the imperial household, paintings, porcelain. Some of it was tribute to the emperor, gifts by officials who were trying to suck up to the emperor. Some of it was a lot of it was confiscated from corrupt officials over the centuries, and some of it was purchased. Some of it was bought by the emperor and by the imperial household. So you have in the Forbidden City this mountain of incredibly valuable, priceless art, which very few people have ever seen. And very few people know in toto what it actually consists of. There are catalogues from the Qing dynasty, but there's so much of it, nobody really knows what's there. After the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, imperial China dies. It's the end of the imperial dynasties. China becomes a fragile republic in 1912. The last emperor, Puyi, is allowed to stay inside the Forbidden City. There he is, that's him, the little boy up there. Anybody know who that is?
Teacher.
Yes, his teacher, that's right. A Brit called Reginald Johnston, whose story is told in Bertolucci's film The Last Emperor, played by Peter O'Toole. If you haven't seen it. Puyi is allowed to stay in the Forbidden City with a shrunken imperial household. The imperial collection becomes a source of income for him. Stuff's getting stolen all the time. Eunuchs are ripping stuff off and sneaking it out and selling it in the antiques markets. And the collection is under a certain amount of assault at this stage. Come 1924, Puyi himself, the last emperor, is booted out of the Forbidden City. And the Forbidden City is no longer an imperial household. It's a set of empty palaces, empty of people, but stuffed with art. The new Republican government formed a committee called the Committee for the Disposition of the Qing Imperial Possessions. And this committee was supposed to figure out what to do with everything that the dynasties, the Qing dynasty, the fallen Qing dynasty, owned. They came in and they started taking an inventory of all the objects in the Forbidden City. But, you know, the question for the Republic, for Republican China, was, what do you do with all this stuff? The palaces, the art. What do you do with this vast imperial patrimony when you're trying to create a modern nation state? What is the role of all this stuff in a new Republican modernized nation state? First of all, what they have to do is figure out what is in the Forbidden City. So in 1924, a group of professors, of academics, are invited down to go into the Forbidden City and to start to count everything that's in there and do a full inventory of everything that's going on. By this stage, the place is starting to fall into disrepair. There's a postcard from the time. And you see the weeds growing up and the tiles falling off. And the thing everybody talks about is the weeds. It started getting incredibly overgrown very quickly.
Is that sand or snow?
I think that's just the concrete, actually. I think that's just the flags, the flagstones. This group of academics were brought in, and they literally walked into the Forbidden City in small groups. They organized themselves into small groups, and they walked into these vast palaces, and they literally started counting the works of art in there one by one, identifying them, labeling them, and turning them into a catalogue. They had a load of assistants with them who were mostly graduate students from middle schools and high schools in Peking and from Peking University. One of them was called Shan Shuyuan, who wrote his memoir of going in. He said, once I entered the gate, this was probably the Meridian Gate, long tunnel of a gate. The northwest wind pushed me so strongly it bumped me onto the walls on both sides of the gate. It was impossible, the strength of the wind made it almost impossible to walk. You could say I entered the gate to the Forbidden City swirling around in the wind. I said to myself silently, I'm as strong as a bull, because bulls can resist strong head-on winds, and I encouraged myself to overcome this wind and the freezing cold. Entering the Qing dynasty's Forbidden City, the bleak scene jumped before my eyes. Every courtyard was filled with weeds as high as a man. Before we could count the relics, there had to be somebody to blaze a trail through the weeds using a pickaxe and a sickle. In the winter, the wind was piercingly cold. When we exhaled, the air turned to frost. When we entered the palaces, it was even colder. Our feet were freezing like being pierced by knives. Another guy who was with him, whose name was Naju Liang, who I'll talk more about, wrote that his job was to be the scribe for the groups that were doing the counting. But his ink was frozen and his brush was frozen. So he was standing, his feet were frozen, he was so cold, he was blue around the lips, that he had to put his writing brush in his mouth, warm it with saliva, and then try to scrub some ink. And he would be spitting on the ink and trying to get the ink. And so they were shouting out the names of all these things they were counting. And poor Nigel Liang, who was only 18 at the time, was frantically trying to get all this down with brush and ink in sub-zero temperatures in the cold. To give you a sense of what they're up against, that's a scene from one of the library rooms, one of the groups doing the counting. It's complete chaos in there. There are whole libraries of tens of thousands of volumes. There was a thing called the Suku Quenshu, which was a Qianlong compiled encyclopedia of 36,000 volumes, the canon of all Chinese classical literature. And there were just shelves and shelves, storehouse after storehouse after storehouse, of shelving like this, just crammed with documents. And you can see kind of what they were trying to actually achieve as they catalogued.
It looks like water on the ground.
Does it? I hope not.
Doesn't it?
That would be
Here,
bad.
I mean,
Those are baskets.
in China.
There's Nigel Liang. That's the guy with the frozen ink brush. Remarkable person. He was actually a middle school student, and his headmaster recommended that he should be attached to the groups going into the Forbidden City because he had a good hand, he was highly intelligent, and he was totally reliable. This guy ends up, he wrote a very detailed memoir of the whole story, and so he is one of the central characters in my effort. Very resilient guy, great sense of humor, very funny, and full of very telling little anecdotes, which a lot of Chinese memoir is not, if you've read much Chinese memoir. But he has a beautiful eye for the little texture story, so we'll be hearing quite a bit more about him. But the guy who is really the center of this effort, the center of my story, is this guy. Ma Heng, born 1881. His father was a magistrate outside Shanghai, so into a low-level official family. He was betrothed aged 12 to the daughter of a very wealthy businessman. They married in 1902. He was a bright kid. He was tutored at home, crucially, by a man named Ye Haowu, who was a very progressive historian and writer. So he took on a kind of modernizing cast quite early in his life. But his true passion was the past. He, as a boy and as a teenager, he was a fanatical reader of history. He learned how to cut seals. He learned to do calligraphy. He read the Chinese classics. He turned himself into what is called a Jinshi scholar, a traditional antiquarian scholar of ancient China, particularly obsessed with inscriptions. Inscriptions on ancient bronzes, inscriptions on steles and on stone, as a way of decrypting China's ancient past, figuring out the history of Chinese writing, Chinese script, and through that, Chinese intellectual history. There's a picture of him by the artist Xu Beihong with his cigar. Very gentle, quiet man, rather bookish, very non-confrontational. He was a businessman for a long time, but in 1918, his genius with ancient inscriptions was recognized, and he was invited to come to Peking University, not only as a scholar of ancient inscriptions, but also as a teacher of equestrianism, because he was a good horse rider. So he goes to Peking in 1918, and he is one of the top guys who goes into the Forbidden City in 1924 because of his facility with reading inscriptions, with reading ancient Chinese characters, identifying bronzes and things from Chinese ancient past. I must move along, I'm getting bogged down. All of this happens with China is in chaos, it's the warlord period, there's no stable government, and just over the water, Japan is militarizing and building its strength. Throughout this whole period, when the Forbidden City is turned into a museum for the first time in 1925, as the inventory goes on, as the place is overhauled and presented to the Chinese public as a museum, not a palace, as all this is going on, China is heading inexorably towards confrontation with Japan. And everybody knows this is going to happen. (1931). By this time, Japan has taken over all of Manchuria. It occupied the Korean Peninsula long ago. It's now taken over all of Manchuria as well, and the oil and natural resources that are up in Manchuria. The Republic only really controls this little blue bit down here, and all the rest of China is under the control either of warlords or of warlords who are loosely affiliated with the nationalist government. You can see how fragmented China is, and you can see what Japan has in mind. The Korean Peninsula is always China's strategic Achilles heel. It's like a kind of bridgehead into the very center of North China. So everybody knows that's what Japan is trying to do. It's occupying the north, and sooner or later they're going to take the rest of China. (1932), we have outright war breaks out in Shanghai, very serious 2-month-long battle between Republican forces and the Chinese in Shanghai. It's getting ever closer, things are getting very bad. Ma Hung and the rest of the leadership of the Palace Museum, the Forbidden City, realize they have got to do something. The Japanese, here's Peking right here. The Japanese army is literally a 4 or 5 hour drive away, just the other side of the Great Wall. There's supposedly a demilitarized zone there, but everybody can feel how dangerous the situation is. So the Forbidden City decides that what it's got to do, the Palace Museum decides what it's got to do is it's got to take the cream of the collection, about 200,000 pieces, and it's going to crate them up. It's going to pack them and box them up in crates. And it's going to move them out of Peking, destination to be decided. Everybody in the Forbidden City gets going on the packing. They drop everything and they get going on choosing the best pieces of art and the packing. That may be the best photograph that we have of this process. You can see one of the groups, a couple of curators, a security guy, you can see a military guy here. There are observers, there are scribes going through, they're taking the objects off the shelves, they're deciding which ones they're going to pack, and then they are bringing in these wooden crates and they are packing them. Incidentally, you see those jars there? They are bronze wine jars from the Zhou dynasty, and there is one of them in the Taipei Palace Museum today, same jar. But the entire Palace Museum is now in a frenzy of trying to pack 200,000 pieces of art. How do you do it? How do you pack this incredibly fragile, delicate, ancient stuff? Nigel Liang is very much involved, so is Ma Hung. The early attempts at packing are very difficult. They don't know how to do it. So they go down to the antiques markets in South Peking, and they ask the antiques dealers, how do you pack this incredibly fragile porcelain? And they bring in these antiques dealers to help them figure out how to pack. They buy in hundreds of wooden crates, which have previously been used to transport cartons of cigarettes. And they think these will be up to the task. But no sooner have they started packing them, they realize that they're too weak. Whenever they put anything heavy inside them, the crates start to buckle. They buy second-hand cotton wadding. Cotton wadding as you get in a Chinese padded cotton jacket. But when they pull it out of its sacks in order to pack the art inside it, it fills the air with cotton fibers and everybody starts choking. And it has it's lost all its elasticity. It isn't springy anymore because it's all dried out. Also, writes Nigel Liang, it absolutely stinks. So they're in these rooms with this horrible cotton wadding and nobody can get on with it. The packers that they bring in from the antiques markets are very condescending and rude, says Nigel Liang. So they have a very bad time and they have a lot of arguments with the packers from the antiques markets. So they have to start all over again. They decide on specially built, newly designed crates. They buy in new cotton wadding, and they sack all the packers from the antiques markets, and they decide to do it themselves. Among the most difficult things they had to pack were the stone drums of Qin. I'm going on a little too long, so I can't go into too much detail on this. These are chunks of rock. They're not really drums at all. They're boulders. They stand about yay high off the ground, and they're inscribed with a very particular kind of early Chinese script, a transitional form of script between one very early kind of script and another later kind of script. Hugely important. The inscriptions were carved in about 500 to 600 BC, middle of the Zhou dynasty. These things have been lost over the centuries, they've been found again, and they've been lost again. And for the last 600 years, they've sat in the Imperial Academy, the Guozijian in northeast Peking. I'm going to read a little extract of my first draft here, just because it gives you some idea of what was going on at this point. It's not too long. Ma Hung decides that these things have got to be packed and they've got to leave Peking. There are 10 of them, and they weigh half a ton each. Right? He sends down an order to a young packer named Zhuang Yan, who is a graduate student at Peking University, an archaeology student. So this is from my first draft. Strap yourself in. Zhuang Yan read Ma Heng's order with stupefaction. It was, he wrote, a bolt from the blue. He was to proceed to the grounds of what had once been the Imperial Academy, the center of Confucian learning under the Qing dynasty and before. The academy stood adjacent to the great Confucius temple in the northeast of the city. There, to Zhuang Yan's astonishment, he was to take possession of and pack for transport artifacts known as the stone drums of Qin. The stone drums were not in fact drums, they were boulders, chunks of granite standing between 2 and 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. They were short pillars of rock, their shape faintly reminiscent of traditional Chinese drums, hence the name. They had no musical function at all. Zhuang Yan stood in the February chill, this is February 1933, and stared at them. He had overseen the packing of thousands of cases, but the idea of the packing of the stone drums filled him with fear and trepidation, he wrote. I had absolutely no idea how to do it. The problem lay not only with their size and excessive weight, but oddly with their fragility. The value of the stone drums lay in the inscriptions that adorned them. We'll skip forward a little bit. These poems are of ancient Chinese, the inscriptions are of ancient Chinese poems from the classic of history, the Shi Jing. The reason that the drums are so fragile is that's Zhuang Yan, the young archaeologist. The reason they're so fragile is they've started to flake off on the outside. So any external pressure on the rock causes it to shatter and flake off further. Zhuang Yan's solution to the problem of how to pack the drums took him to that part of the city that the scholars both loved and resented, Liulichang, home to the city's voracious antiques dealers. At a renowned antique store called the Studio of Distinguished Antiquity, he spoke to the proprietor, a man named Huo Baolu, who was, to Zhuang Yan's mind, the foremost collector in Peking. If anybody knew how to pack the stone drums, it would be him. Mr. Huo comes up with a solution. Mr. Huo's method required Zhuang Yan and the curators to take the most delicate cotton-based paper and soak it in water. Then, using tweezers, they would insert scraps of the wet paper terribly gently into the tiny fissures between the body of the rock and the elevated slivers on which the inscription lay. The idea was to fill in the slender gap between the two, providing a bolster for the brittle elevated shards so that external pressure would not cause them to crack and flake off. The work of filling the cracks and fissures was extremely difficult, Zhuang Yan wrote. Progress was extremely slow. It took them a month just to stick the paper on the cracks. After that, they then wrapped the whole drum in very, very fine cotton cloth. Then they covered the whole thing in a kind of glutinous paste made from rice, which when it dried, rendered the whole thing immobile. Then they wrapped it in the cotton quilting. Then they wrapped it in fine hemp cord, then more cotton quilting, then heavy hemp cord, and then more cotton quilting. By this time, each drum was about that big. Then they put it into a specially constructed case, and they screwed iron bars on the outside. The entire case now weighed nearly a ton.
So how did they lift it?
They hired in vast amounts of labor, lifted it off the ground, put it on a little, I'll show you a picture of it. Of all the objects packed for transport, the largest, the heaviest, the most unwieldy, and perhaps the most irreplaceable were the stone drums. Zhuang Yan spent years in an agony of concern for the drum's safety, endured a nagging anxiety that he hadn't done enough to protect the inscriptions. They weren't unpacked for 25 years, so nobody knew for 25 years whether or not the inscriptions had been saved. Okay. By early 1933, the cases, 2,000 cases, have been made ready for transport. There they are. They've been hauled across the vast courtyards of the Forbidden City. They're here next to the Taifa, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, ready for transport. February the 6th, 1933, the streets outside the Forbidden City are shut down. 2,000 policemen line the way to the railway station. A train is waiting with 18 carriages, steam up, 100 armed guards aboard, and a machine gun on top of every carriage. At dead of night, in the freezing temperatures, they load 2,000 cases onto hand carts, and they move them out of the southern part of the Forbidden City down to the Tiananmen railway station, and they load it onto a train, and the first train leaves Peking with 2,000 cases on. Destination Shanghai. Over the next few months, 20,000 cases of art would leave the Forbidden City by train and make its way down to Shanghai. In Shanghai, the art was stored in the French concession, in an enormous warehouse in the French concession on Rue Montauban. And that was the first stage of its journey. It was all there by late 1933, and they thought for the time being we're safe. We're in an international French concession of extraterritoriality. We should be okay here for the time being. But they're making plans already for the next step. I'm having to sort of skip over some of the detail here. But while it's in the French concession, they decided it would be a nice idea to have an exhibition of art in London. So they've been invited by the Royal Academy of Art in London, the British Museum, to go to London with some of this art. So they dig out, there's just another image of them coming out from the Forbidden City. They dig out several hundred of their finest pieces. They load them into steel-lined steamer trunks, and they take them to the docks in Shanghai, and they load them onto a British warship, HMS Suffolk, which takes 80 cases of this art to London for the 1935 exhibition of Chinese art at Burlington House in London, which was a fantastically important exhibition. Everybody went, Virginia Woolf went, T.S. Eliot went, everybody, 400,000 people visited Burlington House in London to see this art. And that exhibition was seen as the moment that when Chinese art ceased to be viewed as exotic, that the word curio was no longer used, and in the West, the Western understanding of Chinese art history really began then. It was the sort of foundational moment of the West's realization of the importance and significance and vastness of Chinese art. Nothing in this story, however, goes smoothly. And on the way back from London to Shanghai, they're the sailors loading it onto the warship. On the way back, it comes back on a commercial liner, P&O liner called the Rampura, the SS Rampura. And as the SS Rampura comes round Spain, it runs aground off the coast of Gibraltar. Total panic. Everybody freaks out. And here is so I'll come back to that. There they are actually in the London exhibition, opening up the cases. That's a Reuters report that comes out April 14th. Anxiety in art circles is increasing with regard to the safety of the P&O liner Rampura. Now on the rocks off Mayorga, the northwest extremity of Gibraltar Bay, with a rough sea running and 10 million pounds of Chinese art treasures aboard. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you write the lead to a news story. The journalist in me rejoices. It's just beautiful, right? A rough sea running. Anyway, this damn ship is stuck on the rocks off Gibraltar for 3 days with this vast amount of Chinese art on board, priceless Chinese art. Eventually, they're able to float it off, and the Rampura is not damaged, and everybody breathes a massive sigh of relief. It's able to continue on its way to Shanghai. Among the treasures that are on that ship, I should just say briefly, is a painting by Zhao Gan from the Southern Tang Dynasty, so the 10th century. And it's called Jiangxing Chuxue. It's called Traveling by the River in First Snow. Often in English it's just referred to as early snow on the river. Here's a couple of details from it. It's a hand scroll about 7 feet long, about that high. It's one of the most beautiful and absorbing, mesmerizing pieces of court painting in all of Chinese art. It depicts travelers by a river. There's a guy up here, his 2 wives and their servants, on a cold, cold, windy day. Extraordinary brushwork, rippling the water, the brushwork on the reeds, the wind coming through the reeds, blowing the reeds. And it's a study not only of nature and of the river, but it's a study of the lives of fishermen in the Tang Dynasty. And you can see in extraordinary detail the lives of how fishermen lived, right down to the mechanics of how they worked their nets. It's all scientifically completely accurate. It's a beautiful depiction by somebody who had made an extraordinary study not only of the lives of fishermen by the river, but of nature too, and of the fall of light on water and the fall of wind on plants. And it's just an absolutely staggering piece of art. Ink on silk, terribly, terribly fragile. And they managed to get it the whole way to London, the whole way back, it ran aground. Now it's back in Shanghai with back safely in the French concession. But things are about to get a whole lot more difficult. 1937, by this time, incidentally, Ma Heng, our friend Ma Heng, is now director of the whole Palace Museum. And it's his responsibility to keep these 20,000 cases, actually 19,577 cases of art safe. 1937, all-out war with Japan. Japan sweeps down from the north, takes Peking, sweeps up from Shanghai towards the capital, the Republican capital, Nanjing, here. All the brown area is now Japanese occupied. Shanghai is clearly no longer safe. They must move the art shortly before this map. They've decided to move the art first to Nanjing, where they've built a purpose-built storage facility. But then Nanjing is obviously not safe. They've got to get out of Nanjing. So they decide, along with the entire Republican government, all the universities of East China, all the establishment of government of East China, they're going to migrate to the west. A massive migration takes place to Western China. And the art goes with it. They split it into 3 groups. The first batch leaves Nanjing in December 1937 as the Japanese are right at the gates of Nanjing. The first batch is put on river steamers leased by Ma Heng from Butterfield and Swire, the British company. They get out of Nanjing in early November. They make their way the whole way down the Yangtze River to what's now Wuhan, where they're put on trains and they make their way down to Changsha, capital of Hunan province, right here, where they are stored in a university library. Ma Heng still isn't happy. The Japanese are pushing across China. He decides they're no longer safe in Changsha. He puts them on trucks. This, incidentally, is just 80 cases. It's the 80 cases that went to London. It's quite a small consignment. They're put on trucks, and they're driven the whole way down into Guizhou, very remote southwestern China, where Ma Heng and Zhuang Yan have found a cave here, this place called Anshun. They found a great big limestone cave. They've built a structure inside it, and they store the 80 cases of art in this cave in Anshun. The second batch of art leaves, get my dates right, The second batch leaves from November 20th to December 8th. 9,369 cases are loaded onto steamers, more steamers hired from Butterfield and Swire. They don't get the last batch out until December the 8th. Nanjing falls on December 13th. On the docks at Nanjing, it's swamped with refugees. The city's burning, there are Japanese air raids every day, the Japanese are right outside the gates, there's artillery fire coming in, the river, there are bodies floating in the river. The docks are swamped with refugees. The guy who is in charge of this shipment is a man named Hang Li Wu, who was working on refugee issues, but he was transferred over to work on getting the art out of Nanjing. He is standing on the dock, and the ship, already loaded with cases, has stood off the quay because they're terrified of getting swamped by refugees. Hang Li Wu can't get on the ship. Everybody's screaming, the crowd is surging, and the ship has pulled off the dock. And the captain is shouting down to him, "You've got to get aboard." And Hang Li Wu's shouting back up, "How? How do I get on?" So in the end, they throw ropes down to him. And he fights his way through the crowd, and he grabs onto a rope. And the sailors on the ship just pull him. He jumps off the quay, and they pull him to the side of the ship. And they pull him up the side of the ship and drag him over into the ship. And the ship then turns out into the channel, turns west, and starts making its way away from Nanjing. That's December 8th. December 13th, the Japanese take Nanjing, and we know what happens after that. One of the greatest and most heartbreaking, stomach-churning events of World War II. Hundreds of thousands of civilians slaughtered, tens of thousands of women raped. I mean, just a ghastly 6 weeks following Nanjing. As Hang Li Wu was getting on the last ship to get out, the third batch of cases was being loaded on trucks under the watchful eye of this guy, Ouyang Daoda. He was a rather dry old stick. We don't know much about him. I haven't got a lot of biographical detail on him yet, but he didn't have much of a sense of humour. He was a horrible writer. He wrote in great detail with absolutely nothing experiential at all. He never tells you how he's feeling or what he ate for dinner or anything. But he was incredibly efficient. And I think he was pretty much the guy who managed to keep the curators together and keep their standards up throughout. He was a disciplinarian. Under his eye, 7,286 cases are loaded onto trucks. First onto a train. They leave Nanjing, they go north again, they go west to a place called Baoji up in Shanxi province. Then they are loaded onto trucks. The aim is to store them in this place here called Hanzhong. They're driven by 300 trucks down to Hanzhong. It's a nightmare. The whole trip is a nightmare. They can't find the trucks, they can't find the drivers, they can't find the gasoline. They keep getting taxed on the roads, they keep getting shaken down. It's just an awful, awful experience. They get to Hanzhong, Ma Heng decides Hanzhong is not safe either. They're ordered to drive the whole lot to the capital of Sichuan province, Chengdu, down here. This was probably the worst leg of the entire story. It's late winter by this time in 1939, we're in now. There's no plan for where these cases should go. They're making it up as they go along. As they're unloading the trains, actually at Baoji station, a truck loaded with cases crosses a railway line in the path of an oncoming locomotive, and the two collide, and a whole lot of cases get smashed to smithereens. Porcelain is shattered, some ancient bronzes suffer badly. Ouyang Daoda is absolutely incensed. He's furious. He's trying to maintain, you can get a sense at this point, he's trying to maintain a very, very high level of discipline among everybody who's handling the cases. And he writes to everybody involved, what's the point in us bringing 20,000 of cases of art to the west of China if you're just going to break it when it gets here? Here, they transfer to trucks to get to Hanzhong. Hanzhong is bombed by long-range Japanese naval aviation, G4M bombers. They move it out of Hanzhong down to Chengdu city. The only problem is there's an enormous mountain range called the Qinling between those two cities. And the trucks are sliding across these, up and down these ghastly, hairpin, snow-covered tracks. At one point, the entire convoy gets snowed in and runs out of food. Na Zhiliang is called upon to set up a relief convoy, and he and other people have to get in a truck and drive food up to somewhere up in here in the Qinling Mountains. And they write about how all of them are just peering out into the darkness as the truck is careening up these mountain passes, and how they're just soaked with sweat, terrified as they're going up and down these ghastly icy mountain passes. Eventually they get them to Chengdu. These cases are stored in a Buddhist monastery in Chengdu, much against the wishes of the monks. The monks refuse to stop doing their cooking and lighting votive candles all around the place. So they're terrified. Ouyang Daoda is terrified it's all going to go up in smoke. So they're moved again out to Ermeishan. By late 1939, all 20,000 cases are pretty much safe and secure, stored in temples, caves, and ancestral halls here, and here in Anshun. There they remain for the duration of the war. The Japanese are no longer their enemy. Their enemy is now damp, humidity, and termites, right? Termites are a nightmare for everybody. They've stored these wooden cases off the ground, get air circulation underneath them, but the termites can climb up. In Chinese they're called bai, white ants, but they are actually checked, they are actually termites. The termites make their way up the racks that the cases are on, and they eat their way into the wooden cases. And once they get in there, the paintings and the Qing and Ming dynasty encyclopedias and libraries are all just turned to dust in hours. So every day they have to go out and they have to crawl, the curators have to crawl under these racks and put down lime and search every single rack for termites. Termites are the greatest enemy they now face. A couple of times a year, more, they have to open every case, take out all the books and all the paintings and hang them up in the sunshine just to dry them out and just to try and let spores and mold blow off. They're occupied doing this until 1945. For 6 years, that's what they do. They have no salary, they have no clothes, they've got no money, they've basically got no food. Some of them, their wives go off and find jobs in local schools, teaching, things like that. Ma Heng is here in Chongqing, the wartime capital, trying to coordinate everything and going out and making sure that everybody's okay and planning for what he hopes will be a future, but nobody knows if there is a future or what it will hold. 1944, the Japanese launched the Ichigo Offensive, very little understood Japanese campaign. What am I doing? I'm going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. And the Anshun cases get moved up to Baxian here. 1945, victory, Japan surrenders. Surely it's all okay now. The cases can go back to the Forbidden City in Beijing. It takes them a year to get all 20,000 cases back here to Nanjing. Where's Nanjing gone? Back to Nanjing here. But of course, as soon as they've got there, by 1947, the Chinese Civil War restarts. Communists are pushing in from the north and the northwest. Uprisings are starting all over the country, and the Republic of China is tottering. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Chiang Kai-shek, of course, decides that he is going to run for Taiwan, retreat to Taiwan. He takes the National Bullion Reserve and his entire government and the KMT archive with him, and he orders the curators in Nanjing to select the very, very best of the art, to crate it up again, put it back on a train, get it to Shanghai, and get it on steamers down to Taiwan. The government also sends a letter to Ma Heng, who's by now back in Beijing, up here. And they say to Ma Heng, you're the director of the Palace Museum, you're coming with us, and you're bringing all the best stuff that's still in Beijing with you. Get yourself down here, get on the steamer, get yourself down to Taiwan. Ma Heng stalls. He says, I'm sick, I've got a heart condition, the planes aren't flying. And it's clear that we now have a split between the curators. These guys who've been together for 25 years through thick and thin, through the entire war, split. Na Zhiliang and Zhuang Yan, the two younger curators, decide to go to Taiwan, and they escort 2,000 cases of art to Taiwan. Ma Heng and Ouyang Daoda decide to stay in Beijing and wait for the communists. Na Zhiliang gets and Zhuang Yan get the cases to Shanghai, and then Na Zhiliang describes in his memoir taking the steamers down to Taiwan. Again, the docks are full of refugees. Half the KMT army is trying to get out. There are aircraft overhead. The communists are at the gates. Na Zhiliang begs and borrows and negotiates his way onto various different steamers and trap ships and naval vessels with these 2,000 cases. And he himself gets on one, and he describes the 4-day journey down to Taiwan. Terrible weather. They didn't have time to tie down the cases. Ship is rolling terribly. Every time it rolls, the cases controlling millions of pounds of priceless art are sliding across the deck and crashing into the other bunker, sliding back and crashing into the other bunker. Na Zhiliang himself is horribly seasick and spends all 4 days just standing on the side throwing up. So he can't even look after the cases, he's incapacitated. And the worst thing of all, he says, is the captain of the ship has this dog, and the dog does nothing but howl for 4 days. So he's on this ship in a night with the storms and the waves, just being violently ill with this howling dog going all through the night. Anyway, they finally get their 2,000 cases of art to Taiwan, and those 2,000 cases now, of course, make up the core of the Palace Museum Taipei. That's the Palace Museum Taipei, those 2,000 cases of art. I'm going to leave it there. That's pretty much, there is more to the story, but I'm going to stop, and if anybody has any questions, we can try and fill in some gaps.
That's a very exciting story, but you only brought us to the present with 2,000 of the cases. There must have been a large fraction in Beijing.
So the rest of them are now, some of them stayed in Nanjing. Most of them went back to Beijing after the communists took power, and they are now back inside the Forbidden City, and they are the museum inside the Forbidden City. That's the art that you see. If you ever go to the Palace Museum in Beijing, that's what you're looking at.
Did any stay in Nanjing?
About 2,000 cases remained in Nanjing, and they're in museums in Nanjing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anybody else? I can't believe I've told it that exhaustively.
With all the security at the rail station when they were initially trying to get things out of Nanjing, how did they manage not to tip off the Japanese? And there must have been spies and people.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. And the Japanese then were still the other side of the Great Wall. There was a demilitarized zone. I'm sure the Japanese would have known what they were doing. Every day, Peking, Beijing was being overflown by Japanese aircraft anyway. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were flying over the city, taking photographs every day anyway. So yeah, they'd have known. But I guess it just wasn't in their plan to intervene at that point.
In researching your narrative, what documents did you find, and what kind of documentation do they have that you could access?
Right, great question. So most of this comes from secondary Chinese, some of it comes from primary Chinese sources in the form of memoir. Ouyang Daoda, the rather po-faced guy, wrote an official report, which wasn't found until 2002, and only published in 2006. But a very dry, very detailed chronology of everything that happened. So the skeleton of the narrative is all there. For the sort of experiential stuff, it comes mostly from memoir. 2 biographies have been written in Chinese of Ma Hong, the director of the museum. So I'm relying fundamentally on that stuff. There's been some academic work done in Chinese on it, which I'm using too, but that's the skeleton of it. I haven't done archival work in China. I've relied on sort of secondary sources on archival work in Taiwan. I'm not equipped really to do.
But you've been to the Forbidden City and seen the museum.
Not lately. I've spent much more time in Taiwan. The Taiwanese are a lot more open, let's say, and accessible to me. So that I'm relying on the Palace Museum Taipei pretty much for everything. Yeah.
I was wondering when the U.S. Navy got involved, if it did, how many shippings there would have to be for that number of cases to arrive in Taiwan. And I wonder if there's any counterpart East Asia, China Monuments Men story where the American wartime government would have been very concerned about now that Chinese art is taken seriously, about the preservation of this art as much as possible. Did we get involved?
On your first question, there was a report for a long time that the US Navy did get involved. It's now been debunked. The US Navy did not, The US Navy was not involved in shipping. That's the latest that I've seen. And shipping from Shanghai to Taiwan. It was all KMT naval vessels, Republican naval vessels, and chartered ships. On your second question, I certainly hope it feels like the Monuments Men because it'll be a very successful book if it does. There does seem to be an appetite for stories about artifacts in wartime. There are a number of. There's the Monuments Men. There's a wonderful book called The Hare with Amber Eyes. I don't know if anybody has ever read that, about a Netske collection that was rescued from the Nazis in Austria. So there's quite a bit of this stuff. But this story has not yet been told at length in English. There have been a couple of studies of it done as museum history in English, but it hasn't been told as a war story, or even really as a story about the people and the art. So I'm hoping that yes, I can write a book that does feel a bit like the Monuments Men, exactly. Yeah.
Do you have any details about how they negotiated with the French government to store because the original destination was the French concession in China?
That's right. Really good question. So, no, I don't is the answer to that. They rented commercially a 7-story building in the French concession on the Rue Montauban, known in Chinese as Catholic Church Street. And it was a disused hospital, if I remember right. 7 stories, they just hired people to wrap it in barbed wire, they put art lights on it, they set up an alarm system and stuff. The French must have given their assent, I guess, but I'm not aware of how that negotiation went. That's a good question. Yeah?
The original cataloging, did they have a system for how to determine where things were when they needed to go and select what pieces to use?
Yes.
Or was it more just let's document everything that's here?
Yeah, no, they were very careful about recording, about naming the object, giving it a number, but also ensuring that they knew precisely which part of the Forbidden City it had come from. So every hall, every palace, every building that they went into, they ascribed an identifier to each piece. In each case, all the identifiers were... On one of these pictures, you can sort of get a sense of... That's a picture of the trucks coming down the chimney mountains. images of that's a truck on a raft being taken over the, also in the Chinling coming down towards Chengdu. Should have showed you these while I was telling you about it. That's the communists taking Beijing. There's there. That is actually in Taiwan after arriving in Taiwan. But one of the reasons that this picture is so interesting is you can see the labeling on the cases. This character here and this number tell you, as I understand it, tell you precisely which who packed it and which hall it came from. And then that number up there is the actual number of the case. And then in the catalogue will be a description of every single piece that's in that case. And that's the Palace Museum seal on top of it. So you can get a sense for the very, very rigorous cataloguing and labeling system that they had in place, which didn't break down. It stayed intact for 16 years. Wow. It's just extraordinary. Through all that, the labeling system worked. And I think it was pretty much Ouyang Baodar that cracked the whip and just made sure everybody was so terrified of him that people were incredibly careful about maintaining the labeling system as they went. Yeah, Margaret.
So you mentioned in bits and pieces how the curators were responding to orders they got from the nationalist government, for example. But do you get the sense that these men were mostly trying to preserve it for their own artistic reasons? I mean, where's the agency in all this, knowing that there's some of both? I'm just curious as to your impressions.
It's the central question. It's sort of why did they do it? What were their motives and what was the politics of it? And the answer is I don't really know yet. By the 20s and 30s, people were now referring to these objects as guobao, as national treasures. So they were being seen as representative of the Republic and the Republic's legitimacy as the true steward of China's cultural patrimony. And that's the role that this collection has always played, and still does play. On one level, reading the memoirs, it's all quite simple. Well, obviously we have to protect it. It's China's cultural patrimony, and we'll die before we allow this stuff to be taken by the Japanese. That's what you read in the memoirs. Quite what the political equation was among the higher levels of the KMT, why they were prepared to sacrifice resources to do this, hundreds of trucks, vast amounts of gasoline, desperate times, a lot of money, it was expensive. Some of it was paid for by Boxer reparations, returned Boxer reparations. I have a pet theory that for the curators themselves, this whole thing kind of rescued them as individuals. I think that it gave them purpose, identity, status, and a reason to get through the hell that was the migration to the West. I haven't talked in detail about just how mercilessly difficult that migration was, but the refugee flows from east to west were privation, and the suffering and the danger were truly awe-inspiring. But these guys knew what they had to do, and I think on some level that gave them, a personal. It was a kind of salvation for them. They had purpose. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in the museum in Taiwan, are these people able to see them at least from time to time?
Yes, a lot of them are. Some of these are on permanent display. I mean, the collection in Taiwan is now much bigger. It's increased a lot, but plenty of the art that went to London, went back to Shanghai, went to Anshun, went all over the place, and ended up in Taiwan. Plenty of that is on display in the Palace Museum. The jade cabbage, which everybody goes to see in the Palace Museum, Taipei, is one of the artifacts that made this trip. Yeah. And of course, that's on permanent display, and its queues are round the block to see it, day after day after day after day. I don't quite understood why, but yeah.
Did any of the art art that was in the original Forbidden City that was not curated, that was not taken, survive?
Right. Yes, it did. The Japanese, they did raid the Forbidden City. They didn't do it nearly as much as everybody thought they would. Most of the collection that was left behind in Beijing was not molested. The palace fell into terrible disrepair. It was shut up completely. Ma Heng ordered that all the gates closed and barred. The Japanese could have got in if they wanted to. But there are a couple of reasons why scholars have speculated why they didn't, and it is largely speculation. The first was that the leadership of the Palace Museum that was left behind stayed in Beijing throughout, collaborated with the Japanese. So that story doesn't get told. Nobody talks about it. So that might have helped in keeping, the worst of the looting out. The second reason was the Japanese at this time had Manchuria, right? And they had installed China's last emperor, Puyi, as their puppet emperor in Manchuria. Puyi considered the Palace Museum his personal property. He considered it his personal collection. And the Japanese might have deferred to him on that and have said, yes, of course, Puyi, when the time is right, you will go back to the Forbidden City, you will be emperor of all China again, and you will have your collection back. So perhaps it was that. Maybe orders came down, but we don't really know. And as far as I know, nothing I've seen suggests that people have found the answer in the Japanese archives. I imagine it's in the Japanese archives somewhere, but I don't know if anyone's ever found it. I read no Japanese, so I'm clueless as to what has happened on the Japanese side of this story.
You mentioned saving it from the Japanese. Was there also, you mentioned the split in the curators at the end, was there a sense also KMT, or as high as Chiang Kai-shek, we've got to save it from the Chinese communists. We don't quite know what their attitude is.
Oh, well, I mean, the final leg, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the final leg was exactly that. If he could have, I'm sure he'd have taken the entire 20,000 cases to Taiwan. They couldn't. Logistically, it was impossible. But the order was very much to get the best of the collection.
But I mean, even
and keep it from the
war
communists.
itself with the 8th Route Army and all that.
Oh, back in the...
Yes.
I don't think so. I've never seen any reference to that. Certainly in the memoirs and the writing, it's all about keeping it from the Japanese. A lot of what terrified them most was bombing. Remember, 1932 was the first aerial bombing of civilians and the first aerial bombing of urban areas, way before Guernica in Spain, way before Ethiopia. Yeah? First long-range aerial terror bombing of civilians in urban areas was in China in 1932 in Shanghai. And this terrified people. And everyone was convinced that Beijing was going to be bombed, all Chinese cities were going to be bombed, and all the railways were going to be bombed, and everything was going to be bombed. That was at the forefront of their mind and their motivation, I think. Yeah, was keeping it mainly from Japanese air raids is what really scared them. Yeah.
Why move it so far? Why not build underground bunkers? As you're saying, they're worried about air raids.
Well, they didn't know how far the Japanese were going to come.
And there was no way to find secret locations closer to them?
Pretty hard to keep 20,000 cases secret, I think, particularly when you've got so much collaboration going on. I'm
just thinking of
Japanese
the terracotta warriors
areas.
that were not discovered for...
Oh, well, yeah, I guess. I mean, again, you've got this massive sense. All this takes place in the context of everybody trying to get the hell out of Eastern China and moving to the West. So universities moved, the government moved, schools moved, families moved, whole villages moved. Everybody went to the West. This colossal migration. And so I think they were kind of caught up in that too. Just get to the Hofang, they call the rear areas, just get to the west of China. However you can do it, just get there.
And the financing of the moving of the universities and the scholars and the books and the Palace collection, how was that coordinated or paid for, or was it just a own credit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. As I say, a lot of the movement of the Palace collection came from Boxer reparations.
They didn't sell any of the pieces of it.
Well, that's the slice of the story. I mean, there were sales, particularly early on, to try and finance, pay salaries, things like that. A lot of stuff got stolen. The myth of this is that the collection survived entirely intact. Nary a case was lost, nothing was broken, everyone was heroic, it all came back, and the communists welcomed them with open arms. And that's the prettified fairy tale. In fact, there was quite a lot of breakage. There was a collision at Baoji. At one point, a soldier in Lershand is playing with a hand grenade, standing just outside a wooden, playing with a hand grenade, 2 other guys, he drops it, the grenade goes off, kills himself and 2 other guys. The shrapnel, if there's a shrapnel grenade, shrapnel goes straight through all the wooden cases. Shatters a whole load of yellow Ming Dynasty porcelain, a whole load of clocks and stuff are all broken. On the way back, beautifully, on the way back, and this will be my final, we should wrap up this final little anecdote. When they're coming back to Nanjing in 1946-47, they're driving the stone drums in trucks. And on a windy road just south of the Yangtze River, a truck, there's like a 40, 50-foot drop off to one side. And one of the trucks skids and overturns. Because the stone drums in the back, there are like two or three of the stone drums in the back. Because they're so heavy, they hadn't been roped down, right? They just sat in the truck. Nobody had secured them with rope. The truck turns over, it does a full 180 degrees as it goes over the edge. And the stone drums in their cases fall out because they're not secured, and they just go thump onto the side of the bank, and they lodge on the steep bank. The truck turns over and goes the whole way down, but the stone drums just lodge, sat there. And everybody's, the guy who's able to jump out, the driver jumps out, and he's okay. And they've got these 3 stone drums lodged on the side of the mountain, and they haul them up with ropes and put them on another truck. But of course they can't open them up, so nobody knows if they've been damaged or not. They don't find out until 1953. When they finally open them up, they find out that actually they were all fine, that the wrapping worked, and there was no further degradation of those characters on the inscriptions.
Has everything been
Roll
unpacked?
credits, right? That's the moment at which your movie will.
Yeah.
Why don't we wrap up there? I'd like to give Adam a break, but you're welcome to.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.
Fascinating. I'd also like to give out a thank you to the staff of the Prang Collection for hosting us here. They've been very gracious in helping us set up. And it just occurred to me when you were showing this picture that what better place to have this event than the Prang, where things were shipped over from Japan to protect documents. So it was a fitting place to have the event. So thank you again so much.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you so much for coming.